There's like somehow the network is dropping to NAT64 all the time. No, there's some technical issues with the NAT64. I'm not gonna troubleshoot it when I'm chatting, but yes.
Hopefully everyone can find a seat.
Dave, can you see the slides?
Yep.
I think people are like slowly shuffling in. So it was just there was a break, beverage slash snack break before.
No snacks.
Yeah, no snack. Yeah. Welcome everybody to the BPF meeting. So this is the note well. It tells you like what kind of contributions, like what your contributions do to the IETF, like what kind of rights you grant, and like what kind of behavior you set here. So read all the RFCs. Like don't listen to my summary, but go read the RFCs. And please be respectful for everybody. I don't think like we need this in our group. Like we are like generally very respectful of each other, but it's something that we kind of do it as a regular thing. And we'll take care of the minutes like this time. And really thanks to Dave Taylor for like pushing the document through in record time. So I don't think we've had a document go through so quickly through the process. Like he was like extremely responsive. And so we talk about like the document status pretty much. Like Dave is going to run us through it, like what happened to the document, and then like David is going to go through like what kind of next steps we're going to go through after. So the high level idea is like we're not going to be like meeting in a regular cycle. We'll kind of go to a virtual only mode for a bit, and then we come back and then like get active, and there's like stuff that we have to discuss. And yeah, so all kind of newcomers are welcome. Please, like if you're doing implementations, please feel free to share any kind of questions, put them in here, and we'll be glad to talk about them. Thanks.
All right.
Dave, I'll give you slide control.
Okay. All right, got it, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd fully intended to be there giving this presentation in person, but then a little over a week ago, I got COVID, and so switched my attendance to remote. You're welcome. So I'm feeling much better now, just a little bit of a cough here. So anyway, I'm not going to talk about the ISA because other than on the slide here, the ISA document is in the RFC editor queue. And so it's already been approved, and so there's nothing to talk about.
Thanks to everybody who commented on this like document, and it really like the last couple of months are like fantastic, like since the last meeting as well. So we've gone through a lot of the substantial stuff, and really, Dave, thank you for being responsive and getting everything done. Our awesome AD here who kind of shepherded the cats through the system.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, for pushing stuff through. So, in May, about 2 months ago, we had the LSFMM BPF conference with a BPF track, and I led a discussion there that was about what's the current status in the IETF process. This is before all of the stuff that was the IESG review and stuff that's happened since then. And so I gave a presentation there, and I want to use basically the same slides that I used there minus the ISO ones, because the ISO ones were talking about the open issues then, which are no longer open. And then I expanded it just a little bit at the end with the list discussion since then. And so I'm not going to talk about the ISA, but I'm going to talk about the other ones. So, all right. So our charter has the following work items on it. This is just a cut and paste. And so I've done strike through on the top one because, done. Knock on wood, done. And so I am going to talk a bit about the green ones as being the next three on the list. And I'm not really going to talk about the other ones down below because we kind of said that these are in approximately chronological order, although in some cases there may be multiple happening in parallel, right? But the later ones depend on the earlier ones. And so the ones that I'm going to talk about is the next three bullets. Verifier expectations, where the charter proposes informational. The BPF type format, also known as just BTF, which is the charter designates as targeted for proposed standard. And then notably one or more documents that recommend conventions and guidelines for producing portable BPF program binaries. Notice it says one or more, and so I'm going to talk about two. And again, the slides about these is the same slides that I presented there for those of you that might have been attending LSFM BPF, other than the slides at the end are about the list discussion afterwards about the registration. So that's the agenda for my presentation. All right. So verifier expectations. So these are basically what I propose that the working group needs to do. Okay, now that the ISA is done, what do we need to do? Because it's not a draft to discuss here, right? This is say, what would the work entail, right? So that we can say, hey, are there volunteers to do it? How do we want to go about this? And so on, okay? And so the verifier expectations document is intended to describe what a verifier is expected to ensure, okay? There's at least two, maybe more different implementations of a BPF verifier. And so examples of things that this one might say, and again, exactly what it does say and whether this is the right set of bullets or there's a different variation of bullets is for the working group to decide, right? But here's the sorts of things that I imagine could be in this document, okay? It says, okay, well, a verifier is responsible for verifying that a submitted set of bytecode does not contain things like instructions that are not defined. It doesn't use like undefined opcodes and things, right? It doesn't use registers that are not valid to be used, right? That the numbering space might be more than the number of registers. There's various API contracts, and there's two main types of API contracts. One for BPF program calling into system APIs like helper functions, kfuncs, that sort of thing. And then there's API contracts for the system calling into BPF programs, right? So what's the input to the BPF program, right? What's the contract structure look like? There's an API contract for, in this case, it would be for a program type, right? The verifier says, does this program adhere to the contract that it claims to be supporting? Does the program do only memory pointer dereferencing that it deems to be safe, right? For whatever the definition of safe that it would define, okay? And then does the program terminate, right? Is it, can you prove that it doesn't just sit there in an infinite loop, that sorts of things. So those are the sorts of things that are examples of what this document would talk about as to what the requirements are for any verifier implementation, right? And there could be variations of, well, it should do this or whatever, but those are kind of the four that occur to me as any verifier is kind of responsible for doing something in those four categories, okay? And then the rest is just what should the actual text say and so on, okay? So if you say, well, are we starting from scratch, or is there material already that can be used to steal text from? Okay, and the answer is yes. There's already stuff to steal text from. Okay, so in the Linux kernel tree, there's verifier.rst. Okay, which is there, but it contains a lot of details specific to the Linux kernel verifier, right? So that would have to be up-leveled to say, how do I extract it and not talk about pound defines or things that are C specific, but do it in a more generic fashion to say a lot of the same things without as many of the Linux specific details, right? But there's a lot of good content that's in there. Okay? The other verifier that's out there is called Prevail, at least the other one that I know of that's out there. Maybe there's more than two, where there's an academic paper that's published in an academic peer-reviewed conference. And so there's that contains a bunch of background material about what a verifier is and so on. And so we work with the authors of that paper too. And so maybe there's some text in there that might be appropriate for explaining verifier in more generic terms. And then finally, there was an email thread about, I'm thinking it was maybe early May, or so that was with the subject line, "What security properties does the verifier guarantee?" Right. And so what was interesting is the comments on there, Lexi and others had said, well, here's what it does and does not guarantee, because that really is a frequently asked question. I've heard that question a bunch of times, right? And so the email thread actually contained a bunch of good points there with sentences that might be valid to copy into in some form in the right place in a draft. And so the point is that I think we kind of know what should go in there, and there's a bunch of source material to pull from, and it just needs somebody to do the editing and pull from that source material to come up with the first draft. Okay, and so this is kind of, here's the pitch, and need volunteers, because this is really probably the next one in the list if you just go from top to bottom on the list of the charter items. Okay. So unless there's any questions about that one, I'm just going to go on to the next one, because really, I guess it's up to the chairs to do calls for volunteers and things like that. But I'm going to propose, I see Suresh nodding, so I'm going to propose I just go through the stuff, and then the chairs can handle stuff in David's presentation. So.
Yeah, sounds good, Dave. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So the next bullet in the charter is BTF, or the BPF type format. And you say, what is already there? Okay. Well, there's a BTF.rst that's currently in the Linux kernel tree. It's not under the standardization directory, again, just like the verifier one is, but it's there, and it contains a bunch of C-specific information and so on. And so it's a lot of the same state as verifier.rst, which is there's a bunch of great stuff in there. There's some gaps in there, but it's the stuff that's in there is good. And so it needs to move, or a variation needs to move under standardization directory and do the format transformations like we did for the ISA to say, for consistency, use say the IETF packet formats for the structures instead of C type defs and so on. And use tables instead of pound defines, and to omit maybe some kernel specific terms that's specific to Linux and so on. So it does not require huge amounts of technical expertise or BPF expertise, but it requires some documentation expertise, right? Because it's just doing a transform from the file that's there. But then there's going to be some gaps that's in there that have to be filled in that was just never written down in the RST file, right? They may have been written down in patches and emails and so on, but not in the RST file. So there's some gaps to be filled in for sure. All right. And then the next two are on that one or more documents about portable binaries and so on. So the first one is I'm thinking you actually have an older version of my slides here.
Dave, I think Alex
Dave,
has the mic.
Yeah. Add a few comments to your previous slide.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Suresh, can you find? I posted a proposed set of slides about an hour ago. Can you find those and post them? Because there should be more than 6. There should be like 8 slides total. So.
Okay, sounds good. I'll do that.
All right. Go ahead, Lexi.
Yeah. So from the standardization perspective, like BPF, I would say higher than the verifier expectations, mainly because like in the past we had only LLVM generating BTF and it was BPF specific. Now we have GCC that is generating BTF, and not only for BPF target, but for, x86 as well. So BTF now, at least from GCC perspective, is a full-blown debug target, which, it's pretty much like getting in the same category as Dwarf and not having a standard for it, kind of getting a bit uncomfortable. So the sooner we start making a, there is a de facto standard, obviously, but the sooner we get into, actually making a standard, bringing LLVM and GCC people in the room and saying, yes, that's what it is, the better I think everyone will be at the end.
Yeah, from my perspective, I actually agree with that. Right, I was going through the stuff in this order, but you see the BTF document is listed as proposed standard, meaning you got to actually implement that as opposed to the other ones, which are informational, and so that one actually affects interoperability more. And from my implementation experience, the BTF.rst contains more gaps that need to be filled in, because otherwise people will disagree and implement the wrong thing. And so I would also agree that the BTF document is actually, I heard you arguing that one is the highest priority or should be done next. And I'm just saying I completely agree with that. So. Yeah,
I understand that you're just going in the order. It was just like adding extra, color that might not be visible in this room.
Yeah.
What's happening in the industry.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dave, I have updated slides. I'm going to try unsharing and sharing them, see if they pick
Okay.
them up. Like
All
if
right,
not,
cool.
I'll hand you control and you can share
Okay.
the slides from there.
Okay, sounds good.
While you guys are doing that, just one thing I wanted to add about the BTF doc as well is it's not just the BPF ecosystem that would benefit from that as well, because you can have tools like Dragon, like kernel debuggers like Dragon, or other tools that are currently just using Dwarf. I think if we had a BTF standard, they would be more likely to actually build tooling around BTF. So we could, nothing against Dwarf, but I think if we can go with like much smaller footprints and simpler model, then everybody would win too. So there's a lot of like tooling totally separate from BPF that would benefit as well.
This one still looks like it's the 6-slide version. Why don't you just give me the ability to share screen then?
Yeah, ask for it, Dave.
All right, cool. Trying to find
Because
that.
I'm specifically choosing version 01, but it's still not.
Okay. I think that's actually for slides. Let me try this one. Ask to share screen. Okay, it shows that I've asked to share screen. But all slots for requested media are already taken, so I think you need to stop sharing slides first.
I'm not sharing slides. So let me do it.
Okay. All right, do you want to share screen? There we go. That's looking better. All right, you can see screen now?
Yes.
You can see the title slide, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the disadvantage is I can't see you guys when I'm doing this. So if there starts to be comments in the mic, just interrupt me and I'll switch to a view where I can see people, okay? All right, so we were here, moving to this one, okay? All right, so the next document is platform-specific API, or PSAPI. And so this one, at least my understanding of this, is really each particular platform can define a platform-specific API. And of course, we want as few of those as possible, right? Ideally one, but in reality, I might expect, 2 or 3 variations or something of platform-specific APIs, and a large number of platforms that support that, right? When we look at, say, offload cards, and we look at operating systems, and maybe user mode runtimes and things like that, there might be marginal different variations, and so we need to allow there to be a platform that says, here's the variation that I support. Think of it like a profile where we want as few profiles as possible, but we got to have the ability to have profiles. Okay. And so this one, there is a PSAPI document that's under the standardization directory right now in Linux kernel tree. It doesn't have an internet draft built out of it yet, but it is the only other file that's actually in there today. Okay. And so what I would propose the working group do in this category is to say, what are the requirements for a platform-specific API, and other constraints we want to put in there to help reduce the possibility of having a proliferation of them, right? And so, for example, if you're going to define a platform-specific API document, okay, here are the questions you need to answer, right? So it's like the template. You must answer the following 4 things, right, as an example. And we can even give the Linux kernel's PSAPI answers as examples of how to answer it, right? Say, okay, for example, to answer this particular question, here's a popular answer that is widely deployed, right? That sort of thing. So that would be my proposed scope of how to write the document in terms of requirements for PSAPI and then examples pulled from Linux. Maybe, and this is up for discussion, maybe, if there is more than one PSAPI, okay, again, I'm imagining there's probably on the order of 2 or 3 total that might make sense. Then would it make sense for each PSAPI definition, meaning an instantiation of the rules, right? Would that make sense to have some identifier usable with tools? So I could tell a compiler or a verifier or something to say, hey, compile stuff to make sure it matches the following PSAPI definition. Or run a verifier and tell me whether the following thing matches the following PSAPI definition or violates it in some way. Okay. If there's an identifier, that means there's an INR registry, and then each runtime can say, I support the following PS API. And of course, I could do that by, say, RFC number or other document reference, right? But if there's an identifier, that means I can use that in tools, okay? And then a runtime can expose the identifier for use by tools such as compilers, verifiers, whatever it is that are different tools built around the BPF ecosystem. Okay.
Hey, Dave, it looks like Christoph has a question.
Okay. All right, I'm going to switch to a view where I can see you guys. All right, go ahead. Sorry for the infinite view here.
Or rather, a bit of a comment, right? So when we look at like normal operating system or bare metal systems, the PS APIs come out of like long traditions of the respective operating systems or sometimes compilers. We don't really have that for eBPF. So why do you expect us to have different low-level PS APIs? That was actually kind of surprising to me.
The easiest to explain one was one that we agreed that should not be in the PS API, but the easiest, but for everybody that was not at LSFM BPF, I'll just share this because I don't have it on a slide bullet. One of the things that we discussed there was, does how many registers you support, does that belong in the PS API, such that, say, an offload card could say, hey, I have 10 registers, 0 through 10, or Linux might add 0 through 12 or whatever. Is that a PS API thing? And for the rest of the room, we agreed that no, that was going to be baked into the ISA and not in the PS API. But that would have been the most obvious one, right? But there would be potentially other things like, do you support shared memory with maps? Do you support the equivalent of helper functions, meaning the old way of doing by ID rather than by
Those are
BPF
really
ID?
much higher
Yeah.
level questions than
Yeah.
what is traditionally in a PS API document,
Right.
right? I mean, if you look at the PS APIs, most of it is calling conventions. It's like in the Linux API RST files, like what registers are caller saved, callee saved. How do you
Actually,
pass arguments on the stack if you run out of registers to pass them? And the main reason we had differences is A, just different traditions, and B is just the newer operating systems, newer environment actually optimize things for newer hardware. So I'm not going to say an eBPF PS API is never going to change, but I would expect it to be incremental when underlying assumptions change instead of actually starting out with multiple ones, which would actually be in many ways a very bad thing because it fragments the ecosystem all the way up into the tool chain. So I suspect if we can easily do it and actually have a magic number or identifier to identify it, it's probably a good thing for future proving. But if we can get away with it, I would not plan on supporting multiple ones from the get-go if we can avoid it.
Okay, so what I hear you arguing, because in this case, I'll defer to you, as I think you know more about this one than I do, right? It sounds like you're arguing that we should start with only one PS API, and it could be revved in the future. There could be a version 2 of it or a version 3 of it in the future. But if we only start with one, and if we only start with one, then the proposed scope wouldn't be topics for one to answer. It would be the one, right? And then I think you probably argue that then it should be proposed standard, not informational.
Yeah, I've been arguing that since the start, and I lost the argument back then, but I'm going to bring it up whenever I can. But
it's fair. It just means, hey, Eric,
you're volunteered to write it. So
yeah, so I'm just saying, hey, Eric, you're sitting there in front, and Christoph's asking a charter question because it says informational. And is that something we're at liberty to define, or is that something that have to be an AD approval to change from informational to proposed standard?
We want to change the target from informational to PS.
He's arguing this part of the charter here, this one where it says one or more documents that recommend conventions and guidelines, right? He's arguing that among this set of things, there's another proposed standard, and maybe you can argue that the proposed standard isn't in the conventions or guidelines, it's some other bullet here, I don't know, but that would be a question for you as to how would we go about doing what Christoph is saying, assuming there's consensus to go that route.
I mean, These I and PS things were put in here at the request of the IESG. I would not have defaulted to do this, but somebody requested that they be here specifically for some reason. So I think I could take this as a recharter, and I think nobody would care.
The other thing, Christoph, from your perspective, right, because it's not, at least from what I'm hearing from you, one might argue that what you're looking for is not in recommending conventions and guidelines for producing portable binaries, but it's sort of like an extension to the ISA. It's not quite the ISA, but it's an extension to. And so from the ISG's perspective, maybe it's just a subset of this bullet that's, well, you got the core ISA, and then you got the PSABI that's part of the instruction set, how to use it kind of thing, because it's your calling conventions and so on.
I
Right?
mean, it's a little different, right? So the ISA that we've in the editor's queue now, this is
BCP.
highly relevant for any low-level implementation for the actual JIT or HAD or whatever time compilers. The PSABI, on the other hand, is really relevant for the runtime. If you ever deal with helper functions of any kind, if you deal with interoperability inside programs, I mean, we right now don't really do subroutine calls, ignoring the like Linux tail call extensions or whatever that we're not really into right now. But that is where the PSABI starts to really matter. So it's more about interoperability in the quote unquote software ecosystem, while the ABI is the hardware ecosystem that isn't really hardware here, but the
Do we want a
machines.
BCP then?
Well, I guess it depends on whether we can get to whether we can make sure that the entire community is okay with a particular set of things. Once you get into, like Christoph mentioned, tail calls, right? But then you get into things like BPF to BPF, local calls, and so on, and maybe discussions around how much. I don't know if that's the right term. Sorry, I keep misusing the term, right? Stack space, right? You can correct me to whatever the right term is, right? How many different stack frames can there be? How does that work, right? And so that's really part of the calling convention. Are there bounds on that? Like there's, up to 33 tail calls, but then BPF to BPF calls. What do you say about that? And so maybe that goes in there, but do we say that all possible platforms, including offload cards, have to have the same answer, or can there be variations at that level?
No,
If those
but
variations, is that done in the same document or separate documents? So
yeah, but if you look at the history, that actually usually does not go into what is considered PSABI documents, at least in the Unix world. Because I mean, how much stack space you have available in many systems is actually a dynamically configurable setting that you can't actually rely on. So I mean, right now, as I see it, the PSABI document would really be minimal. It would be, except for the boilerplate, really not much larger than the tiny ABI document we have in the kernel tree. It would be a really small document, but actually important one.
it's small enough that we can get you to write it then, right?
So can I jump in? Just to clarify, so when we discussed the charter and put the I next to producing portable programs, back then when in this line we included everything, including like L format,
Yeah, that's the next slide.
IETF
Yeah.
and everything. That's why, like, I think this is still clear. This is I. We are not there yet to be like standardizing like L format and everything, like format of the maps and so on and so forth, the helpers, etc. Like this is much like we're just not ready as a community, I think. But Christoph is arguing, and everything you said is like in PSABI only, in the way PSABI is understood, like System 5, like AMD 64 PSABI, and that is something to be discussed. Like I think it's actually quite reasonable to standardize it, because I don't think, and what also Christoph was saying, that there should only be like really one PSABI, I think that's also supposed to be, because like why we open the door for like anything else? Like we have a calling convention, right? We want like both like hardware, all software implementation to follow this calling convention. That was PSABI kind of cracks of it. That's the key idea, the key concept that it should like convey and standardize. And in this case, it should really standardize and not just be informational. So like 5 arguments there, 5 arguments. That's what we have. That's kind of, well, root, like just like instruction set is just as important as instruction set. So definitely worth the standard badge next to it.
Yeah, all that sounds right to me. Sounds like there's work for you, Eric, unless you tell us we can do it without a charter change, right? Did you just have another bullet there that says proposed standard for the PS API?
I'll actually, I'll actually say, you guys should do the work you want to do in the priority order you want to assign to it, and I will fix whatever other problems I have created with this charter
Yeah.
later.
And
We like that answer.
Do what you think best, and I'll fix the rest.
And I mean, we can just start drafting the document, and then sometime around the adoption call, we figure out what track it goes on.
Yeah,
With you.
and I think, right, like this is not binding on the group, right? It's like a rough set of work items. And we also have VSL words on this. It's just like one or more documents. So like we can think the second PS document as another document for the first item, right? Like, so we can think of like part of the ISA that we do or a follow-up for that, right? Like we could do that. So I think there's a lot of ways around this. As Eric said, right, like the IESG wanted to put it in, so we kind of like took our best guess, but I don't think this is binding at all, right? Like, so we just do whatever we had to do. I don't think it's even a charter thing is required.
All right, sounds good. And thank you, Christoph, for sort of volunteering to write. So you said it wasn't going to be very long, so that's great. All right.
Yeah,
Sean?
It's
Just wanted
the
to
last
jump in.
thing we need for our NVMe use case. So.
There you go. All right, so I'm going to go on to the ELF file unless there's any other questions on your comments on the PS API stuff.
Can you guys hear me? No?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, just we've talked about whether this would be informational or proposed standard. I think quite a few times at this point, like in certain discussions, one form or another, probably like 4 or 5 times. So that's fine. We really need to figure it out. But I just want to echo Christoph's sentiment. Like, let's get it written, and then we'll figure it out. Because I think it's probably the wrong order of operations to keep spinning on the label before we actually have the document in hand.
And we can always do what we did with ISA. We just like kicked from the ISA doc and said, no, that should not be part of this ISA standard because it's really belong in different document. And that might very well happen with this new document. Currently, its current title is PS API. We'll see, we'll figure out what fits and doesn't in this doc.
Yeah, and Dave already hinted he has a ELF slide. So maybe let's jump to that because I think there's a few things that will kind of plug into this too.
Okay. Anything else on PS API?
Alexei, you are in line. Like, did you want to say something or? Okay.
All right, I'm going to go on to ELF then. All right. So again, I'm going to go back to full screen here. Right. Okay, there we go. All right, so again, this slide is the same as what was at LSFM BPF, and then we had a bunch of discussion about this slide that I'm going to report on the other one. So hold questions because all the subsequent discussion I added slides, but right now this slide is unchanged from what started the discussion there. So, a while back, maybe a year or two ago, I wrote draft Thaler BPF ELF as one proposal because I was trying to do some implementation. And there was some info that was in elf.rst, but inside the ELF file also are sections that put in some BTF data. And so I had copied into here some of the information out of BTF.rst that actually should go back into the BTF spec once one exists, right? But one didn't exist, and so I temporarily stuck a section in there with stuff that would have gone in the other document. And it still had a number of to-dos in that version that depended on things that were missing from BTF.rst, at least at that time. Because again, remember, this was like 2 years old. Like what goes in the .maps section, or how do you represent maps in there? What goes in the .btf, et cetera, section contents and things like that that were not in BTF.rst or elf.rst at the time. And so I just said to do because somebody had to write it. Okay. I think a little bit of that content may have been written since then. That this document hadn't been updated since then, right? And so what I learned back in that exercise like 2 years ago was that we kind of need the BTF spec done either first or concurrently, right? You can't do an ELF spec without the BTF spec, right? And I think everybody else kind of already knew that, but I'm just kind of echoing that to everybody else. So we then had a bunch of debate back when the charter was being done on whether this is just to refresh our memories, right, for everybody there in the room. there was debate on whether the ELF specification should be done in IETF or System 5 or someplace else, right? And the discussion at that time, prior to LSFMM-BPF, was that ELF itself was a System 5 spec, right? Now, what we're trying to do is not an ELF spec. We're trying to do how to use ELF for BPF data, okay? And so the intent was that it was a BPF specific, profile, or what other word that is, right? So it could be an IETF, okay? At the time, it was observed it defined eMachine must be set to eBPF 247 in the ELF header. And so at the time, we kind of punted all that discussion until after the ISA was done, and then we said we'd come back to it. But now that that's done, we're kind of coming back to this discussion here, okay? And so we said, what do we do about this? And so then we had a discussion at the conference and then email discussion on the IETF list, which I'm going to summarize now. Okay. So you can go back to the list discussion in May. Here's the subject line, registration of eMachine 247 for BPF in GABI. Okay. And so just to summarize the results of that discussion, the results of that thread, okay. Thank you to Alexi and others who found the actual links and pinged at various people and so on. So these are the facts as I understand them. Back in 2016, Richard Henderson officially registered and got the allocation for eMBPF equals 247. Okay? And there's two links here, which I'll show you what the content of those are on the next slides here. There is a registry right here, just like INA maintains registries. Here, SCO has a registry. The problem is that registry is way out of date, and there's been a bunch of things assigned without the registry page actually being updated. Okay, that is the current state, and it's sort of defunct, and so it may never be updated, even though a bunch of assignments have been made, right? So it's kind of in this bad state, but the registration did happen, right? And so there's a couple of links here that kind of prove that that happened, okay? And so you can see where I'm going, and the other slides of the content is to hopefully get you to believe the same thing as me, or maybe propose an alternative. But I would propose that an ELF spec can be done in the IETF, and to explain that, there would be two normative references: one to the thing that defines the registry itself, which is the SCO link, and the second one, which I'm going to show you here, the generic ABI one, as normative that proves that there's a registration, and maybe this first link as informative. Okay, so that's my proposal, and then I'm going to show you what those are to see if you guys agree. So, so this one is the registry itself. That's the bottom link here, this sco.com, that defines the space and all the different registries and the different fields. And you can see this one, they stopped updating it at 243. Right, we can see BPF was 247. So they did a bunch of allocations, but it hasn't been touched since they allocated 243, right? But since this is the one that defines the registry, it would probably make sense as a normative reference to say, this is where it's defined and where the registry is kept, but we have to have an explanation that says, and that's been obsolete, and subsequent registrations were posted in places like this one, okay? So this is the other one I would propose as the normative reference, okay? And so this is posting from Francois Theron, sorry if I slaughtered the name, where he said, I received a list of recent assignment, which I may post here for visibility. Right? The following are therefore official eMachine EM assignments. And here's the ones after 243, all the way up to 250, and right in there is 247, right? So this right now is the best reference for eMBPF as being an official assignment. This is logically an extension to the registry at this link here, given that SCO never updated their site to add these into there, right? So again, my proposal is we normatively reference this registry plus this posting right here that has the extensions to the registry that were officially allocated, okay? The other link that I think either we don't mention or we mention it informational reference might be okay. Looks sort of like this one. This is Richard Henderson's post, where he actually proposes patches to the elf.h file in Linux. Since my posting 2 weeks ago, I've gotten an official number assigned for eMBPF. And then here's where he adds the eMBPF that matches what was on that previous slide here. So this is where the patch came in, where he's the registrant, where he says, I've gotten an official number. So maybe we informatively reference this one, but I think this one and this one are the official references. And so that was the discussion that we had back in May. But the conclusion is that we believe that the document can be done in the IETF. It is just a, here is what, when you use 247, here is how to use the rest of the existing spec and put in BPF specific information. So,
Hey,
so
Dave.
my
Dave.
slide.
I think David is in the line.
That's the end of my slide, so I'm going to open it up now. So
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Dave. Wait, so like the registration for these IETF, sorry, not IETF, for these ELF numbers are just like a Google group post. Like there's no document anywhere, no repository, nothing.
correct, because those maintaining the repository went defunct. So for IETF people, it would be the equivalent of IETF kept publishing RFCs after IANA no longer existed, right? We'd be in the same state. And so that's the analogy that I would give for IETF people.
Okay. Just feels really odd to like have a normative reference to a Google Groups page. I mean, that's like, or like a post for a patch. I mean, it seems like.
Yeah, you can see they had a mailing list, right? The generic System 5 application binary interface, that's the mailing list. And so that mailing list is the authoritative repository as far as this is concerned. But yeah, it's on Google Groups.
Okay, crazy.
There's nothing better.
So Dave, like what is the probability that something has been allocated since 2017 past the 250 mark?
Alexei, do you know? Probably low, but I don't know.
Okay. So it looks like there might be more. So in the discussion between Alexei and Christoph, there might be more stuff. So we kind of have to figure out like what this is, right? And I'm sure somebody has a list, like because they need to ensure that like two people don't get the same thing, right? Or at least
the .h file in Linux is probably what people use right now.
Okay, so
you look at the code.
Yeah, this looks a bit thorny, right? Because like SCO probably is part of SUSE at some point, right? Like, is that where they ended up? SCO ended up as part of SUSE, right? Or where did they go?
No, I was part of that history a little bit. So SCO got bought up by Caldera a little more than 20 years ago. I was working for Caldera at that point. That's why I remember.
Right, but it went through like a set of sales, and I thought
I was
SUSE
just
was the last one.
Then it got Caldera renamed itself again to SCO. That whole strategy of suing everyone out of existence failed, and everyone hated them. So they sold the Unix business, kept only their weird. Oh God, no. Or they sold the non-Unix. I don't know. They split kinda, and then eventually went defunct. And I'm actually not sure if anyone bought up the assets, but I think someone did. I think there's actually still a company. No, it's definitely not SUSE. Okay. SUSE is not involved.
Interesting. A nice genealogy project for somebody, I guess.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to give my opinion here. My opinion is this is not IETF's problem to solve. Okay, as far as we're concerned, the BPF got a legal assignment. Okay, and we are permitted to write a document that says what that assignment means, because we're the people that collectively, the community, got that assignment, and so we can document that. It's not our problem to figure out the rest of the registry for non-BPF stuff, right? Our problem is just we got to have something normatively referenced, and what I'm proposing is my solution to that.
No, I would just use that as a statement of fact. That's it. Like BPF has this as an assignment and not reference anything, because like I think the shaky ground is like referencing something which we don't know if it's true or not, right? Like about the rest of the things in there. That's kind of my worry.
Right. So you're arguing that we just state that it was received with no reference and not to the registry, meaning don't reference any of these, just state it and leave the evidence on the mailing list.
Correct. Yeah. Thanks.
Eric, you think that'll fly in the ISG?
It's possible somebody will ask. You might have a pointer to, is there a file in the Linux kernel tree that has this information?
Well, no, it's on the mailing list though.
Yeah, you have the Linux mailing list archive.
Yeah, I mean, all of the thread that I just showed you was on the IETF BPF list. So
Can we try like mailing the emailing list and ask them if they have a repository somewhere?
I think Alexei did that, and Richard said there isn't any place, and Alexei said, okay, that should be good enough, right? That's basically how the thread ended, right? So
Right. To be clear, there's nobody here that the IAB can go talk to and liaise and say, can we
correct,
request a type or can we request a copy of this document? There's nothing. Yeah.
correct.
Dave and Alexei too, right? Like elf.h has this number in there, right?
Yeah, that's right here.
Yeah, that's it. That's what we point to. David, did you have a different opinion or?
No, I mean, like with PSABI stuff like this, it usually is like a repository where somebody just merges it. But I don't like, where is this like elf.h file merged somewhere that we can look at, or is it patch form?
Yeah, this is the elf file in the kernel tree, the Linux kernel tree.
Oh, sorry, this is in the Linux. This is the kernel tree. Okay.
Yeah. So it's in elf.h. So I think we can just say, hey, BPF has been allocated this number. Be done with it.
Mm-hmm. All right, that works for me.
All right, so I'm popping back to this slide right here, right? Because I haven't touched this internet draft since like the working group was formed, right? Because we said it's kind of down the list, right? Remember, we said we're going to concentrate on ISA, and it's like way down in this bullet right here. But now that we're there, right? Now, do we resurrect this one? Is it something that we should now try to bring into the working group? Because I know what needs to be done, right? We need to, once there's a BTF spec, I need to remove the BTF stuff and reference the BTF spec, update the things that's there, and then it could be potentially a candidate, right? Because it's just driving information from what's in elf.rst. Right? So that's what would need to happen for this document, I think. So.
Yeah, and if we look at your old draft, or in general how ELF ABIs quote unquote work, they kind of work at two levels, right? So we have the level of what is required for an ELF loader to actually load the program, and that includes the long discussion of like the EM machine value we had, and a few other things. I mean, a lot of it is actually related to dynamic linking, which we don't really have to deal with here in other documents, but things like what actual size has an ELF D word and whatever they call these types in the specifications, which I don't think anyone has actually written down for eBPF because it's totally obvious, but someone actually needs to write it down. And this is what I call the low-level ELF ABI. And then we have the high-level ABI, which is like the non-standard or optional sections, which includes like the maps if people want to do them still in sections. There's some agreement under, and all the BTFs, how all the BTF stuff is referenced, because BTF should be in there on its own. And I suspect, I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect we're better off not mixing them in the same document, because that kind of suggests to people they actually have to implement things like BTF or function or map sections, but I'm not entirely sure. Just want to throw it out there.
Yeah, I put in there because I needed there to be interoperability in a sense between something that generated an ELF file, like a compiler, and something that consumes a BTF file, like, an ELF file such as a loader, right? And like there's multiple different variations right now. It says, how do you name sections? And does that mean anything, right? Is it an arbitrary string? And the answer is, well, no, right now there's like 2 or 3 different conventions, right? And so I think the internet draft right now just is informational document, right? Not proposed standard. It says there exist these 3 conventions out there. Just be aware, right? So just documenting current practice, right?
And that's what this would be one argument for having multiple documents, because stuff like the size of the fundamental ELF data types, the EM machine, this is absolutely like non-informational. This is a hard requirement, while the section types are, they're really interoperability, but they're not fully agreed on. So as you said, I mean, there's a bunch of different variations.
So that's why my intent was to have an informational, just document what's out there right now thing, right? Regardless of making any statement of how it should be, just says there exist these 3 things out there, there's these things out there right now, just having a current state, because that can then inform how you might do a proposed standard going forward. But right now it says, well, let's just document in current practice. So.
No, I think that informational document is very useful, and that's the right track for it. But I think we're better off separating it from the hardcore ELF definitions that every program, even if it doesn't use maps, which most programs probably do, but a bunch of tiny ones like the ones I'm looking into for NVMe don't need require. Then again, we're probably not going to do ELF there, but that's a different discussion.
My opinion right now is that the early version should keep it in the same one, because different people may have different opinions as to what goes in the same document versus in different ones. And that then gives a way to say, well, I think section 4 should be in a separate document. And somebody else could say, oh, but I think section 3 should be in a different document. We can have that discussion. So I'd rather keep it together initially without necessarily presuming that it will stay that way by the time something becomes an RFC.
That sounds like a perfect strategy. Not going to tell you how to do your work before we even get close to publishing it.
I'd say it's really, do we think that the working group is ready to start looking at this now? Because before it's like, well, we don't even want to discuss this yet. It's like heads down on ISA, let's get that one out of the door. And we got that one through in record time. So that's great. Let's declare success and then go on and do another one similarly. So
can't speak for everyone, but I think we're ready to look at more things now.
Okay. I think so too. So you look at the PSABI, Christoph, and I'll look at ELF. So, all right, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back to you, David.
All right, give me a second. I'll grab. I'll share my my screen here.
Dave, I can share the slides and give you control if it's easier for you instead of a screen.
Sure. Yeah, whatever's normal is fine.
It means you have still control of your screen. That's like Dave had issues looking at the video feed, right? Like now you can.
How do I grab control of it?
I gave you control.
Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. So yeah, like everybody said, we've got the ISA doc to the finish line, which is really fantastic. Everybody really helps, so thank you everybody. But of course, more than anybody, huge thank you to Dave. You really drove this thing from start to finish. So thank you very much. So with that said, we've hit this milestone. And so what I wanted to chat about for a little bit is where we're going to be going with the working group from here. You know, as sure. Okay.
We have a slight lag in the thing, so like it took us like 2 seconds to see the slide, so it's perfect now.
Okay, good to know. We obviously still have a lot more work to do, as we saw with Dave's presentation, but we, I think, need to also take a little bit of a step back in terms of how we've been operating and shift to a little bit of what I would call a lower cost model. So for folks at Meta, for example, the expense for coming out to the conferences is getting a little bit difficult for us to justify. I don't think that's going to be a permanent thing, but when we first started with the working group, we wanted to get the ISA doc out, and then we wanted to see what was going to happen in industry. And so the TLDR, there's a lot of reasons to do the standardization beyond just hardware, but the real big main point that we were trying to do, the big use case that we're trying to enable is BPF offload for hardware devices. Because if you're a hardware vendor, you really often, as everybody in this room knows probably better than I do, you need to have a standard to justify the big upfront costs and the investment in building it. And so we have this ISA doc, and the hope now is, okay, we want to continue working. We want to continue to look at the BTF. We want to continue to look at ELF, PSABI, verifier, all this stuff. BPF's a big ecosystem. There's more to document. There's more to standardize. But for now, we want to kind of lower the costs for everybody a little bit and bring it to more of an offline model where we do most of our collaboration offline, and then we meet in person when there's something that we need to discuss, as opposed to the model now, which is more we meet and kind of assume by default that we're going to be here. Which has made sense, I think, up until now, because we didn't know each other. We were kind of, it was a marriage of two communities, the IETF community and the Linux kernel community. Now that we've sort of figured out how to work together, we got the doc done in record time, which I think is really impressive, considering that we were coming from two super different backgrounds. That's great. But my proposal is that for now, we'll start with doing meetings on an ad hoc basis. So send a proposal if there's something you need to talk about, if you want to talk about it in person. And then, of course, also, if we have to meet ad hoc between IETF conferences virtually, we can do that. Because this is what I'm proposing we do from here on out. Again, until maybe there's more activity from vendors and we can kind of justify meeting a little bit more often. It's really, really important to subscribe to the lists. And I know that everybody loves emailing plain text. It's not fun, but this is just a reality of Linux kernel development. And so I think a lot of people have already sort of figured out how to do this and done a great job. And Dave, I see your hand. I'll stop in just a second. But a lot of people have already done a really good job in getting used to that. But I wanted to reiterate the links are here. I'm happy to help anybody that wants to learn how to participate in the upstream process, so that we can collaborate on the list and there's no barriers to entry. But that's sort of where I think we need to go from here to start with. Dave, do you want to chime in?
Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's personally, I think it's fine to say that there's not going to be in the near future anyway face-to-face meetings. I think what I might suggest that the working group that the chairs look at is, should we schedule a virtual interim in lieu of any face-to-face meetings, right? Because that's the way to keep the costs down. But my experience is that if you don't have a meeting, then stuff gets delayed indefinitely, and the meetings are kind of a forcing function to have people get work done. And so scheduling a virtual interim meeting, I think, would still have that positive effect while still not incurring any costs. Now, you might argue that, well, we should just co-locate with other events like, the LSFM, BPF, and so on. But those are not necessarily open to everybody, but at least declaring them an IETF virtual intro meeting gives us access to like WebEx and things, and then they would be open to everybody. And so I'd say just moving to virtual, but still having some type of meeting, I would still find beneficial as long as there's stuff that we need to do. So that would be my suggestion, is move to a virtual interim only meeting model.
Yeah, sounds good, Dave. I think the only constraint really is like not to have it during IETF week, right? So we're not allowed to have it like around IETF week, so we can probably go mid-cycle, like between like meetings, and then go for it. And then we can probably, if there's like stuff that probably requires a higher bandwidth discussion, we can probably pull a side meeting at an IETF, right, if people can attend. So I think we can.
Yeah.
I think that's like a sustainable model, and a lot of the IMAP and email kind of working groups work like this, right? Like they probably meet once every 5 years or something like that. So I think it's a workable model, and it's known to work actually. So
yeah, that is kind of what I was suggesting, is mid-cycle as far as IETF goes, but a virtual interim could actually be co-located with some BPF event, right? As long as we do it virtual. If there's some BPF event, then that would be okay to co-locate, but in between IETF meetings, yeah, is what I was suggesting.
Christoph, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think regular interim meetings are probably a very good idea. I'm not sure how much Dave wants to get away from the in-person meetings, but known from other standards committees or even other groups that work together, I know that face-to-face meetings really help, and I suspect trying to do at least one a year would probably still be useful.
Sounds good. Thank you. That's
Well,
good.
from my perspective, yeah, I mean, it definitely, regular virtual meetings is a no-brainer. We can probably, I guess we'll have to figure out how we plan these and how we kind of solicit agenda items and stuff like that. I imagine it can be largely the same as what we've done for IETF meetings. We'll just do it on our own terms and on our own timeline. And yeah, as far as meeting once a year, I think I'm not opposed to that personally, as long as we have some agenda items to talk about. But at least for Meta, I think I don't know whether we'll be able to get that expense paid for or not. I think we'll have to see. Probably could. But I agree with you though, Christoph, as well. In-person meetings are in-person meetings, so it's good to have if we can do it too. And so we can certainly try to set that up and see if enough people will be able to attend to justify it. No need to plan never to do it, is I guess what I would say.
Sounds good. Thank you. So I think like Gary also chimed in on the chat. about like similar things. So he said occasional, but it could be regular too. So I think the idea is really the big advantage of the interims is that like you don't have to register for an IETF meeting, right? So like anybody who's on the group can participate. So that's good, and we'll try to find some workable time. So I think that's the only big concern with the virtual interims is like how do we not time zone disadvantage somebody, right? Like, but I think if you're like just looking at like North America and Europe, like mainly at this point, I think it's probably easier to schedule. But if you have somebody from like APAC region, I think it becomes a little bit more difficult. But I think this is not insurmountable. There's like this time zone pain file that Martin Thompson did, so we can work out a time that works for people. Was that all you wanted to say, David, or?
Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I'm happy, Suresh. We can chat after, and then we'll follow up with everybody about setting up these virtual meetings and figuring out how to do that.
Yeah, and yeah, that's awesome, Dave. And I had to thank you as well for like shepherding this draft. So it's like your first draft ever. So I'm really glad to have helped you, like me and Eric, to kind of have guided you through that. And that was like really fantastic. And we actually heard comments about your like shepherding work. So that was really, really cool. So thanks for doing that too.
Thank you guys for the help and the guidance through the whole process. Really appreciate that.
And any other business? Anybody in the room or like on Meet Echo?
Dave?
So I think what I heard anyway in the meeting is probably the most important document is the BTF one. And the chairs get to select document editors, but I didn't hear anybody volunteer for the most important document. And so just wanted to highlight that to the chairs.
Yeah, we probably need to solicit some editors or some writers, so we can. Yeah, we'll either send out a call for help on the list maybe, and we can maybe ask some people on the meta side if they'd be interested. And if anybody has anybody else or wants to work on it, that's the best outcome. So feel free to let us know. Does that sound reasonable, Suresh, Eric?
I was going to say, if it's your first time doing this at the IETF, there's plenty of assistance available as well. So, I mean, I'm sure Dave Thaler would help you with sharing his RST to XML tools, and we can plenty of other people around to help you with various other process concerns and things. But it's the expertise that would be great.
Yeah, and this is I don't know if I'd say that it's an easy doc, but there's already a lot of it written. So I think in terms of starter docs, this isn't like you're starting from a blank page. So hopefully that would make it a little easier as well.
Thanks all. So thank you very much for coming. And I think we'll close the session now, and don't be a stranger on the list. Thank you.
I was going to say, though, the interims are done out well, and you know how to file for if you want Meet Echo to continue, but I suspect probably people don't meet without Meet Echo, right? They meet with like Zoom or whatever.
No, Meet Echo. They use Meet Echo? No. I done eBPF. I done a bunch of virtual